purpose of Freethought Forum is to be vigilant to the encroachment of religion into government and to educate the general public as to what a freethinker is.
My thoughts give me power.
No scholar can map them.
No hunter can trap them. No person can deny.
Hello, and welcome to Freethought Forum. I'm Catherine Fahringer, the producer of this show and your host for this program. Today we're going to talk about Margaret Sanger, and the reason I selected her as a subject for this show was that for years I've been seeing dreadful, dreadful letters on the editorial page just maligning her, something fierce. So last week I had the privilege of hearing a program on her at the Secular Humanist Association of San Antonio. The president gave a talk on Margaret Sanger. So I said, Stan, would you like to come and be on TV and tell all the people out there about Margaret Sanger, and let's get the facts straight. Welcome, Stan. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
I thought you got off to a tremendous start with the facts on what people thought about conception. Could you run through?
Well, yes. The people in the early days had no idea at all about the biology, their own human biology. And they did not know where children came from, and there, even in today's society, there are a good deal of theories about where children come from that I gleaned from a book called Sex and History, which in itself is a very good read.
I can imagine.
It's called Reproduction Theories. And in the 1930s, the Balinese of the Solomon Islands thought that children were sent by their social fathers' ancestral deities, and that the only function of sexual intercourse was to provide pleasure. And in the 1960s, the Tully River blacks of North Queensland believed that a woman became pregnant by sitting over a fire on which she had roasted a fish given to her by her prospective father, or by the prospective father. In New Guinea, the Hua tribe still think today that a man can become pregnant and die in childbirth.
I wish.
In India, a Sema chieftain found it impossible that pregnancy could result from only one coition. And in England in 1977, a girl who had borne a child to a black lover and was about to marry a white man wanted to know if the Negro blood still inside her would mean she would continue to have black babies. An American girl at about the same time wanted to know whether the pill would save her from becoming pregnant by her lover as well as her husband. And some modern men take the pill as their wives and girlfriends do, quote, just to be on the safe side.
Oh, great.
And it was only in the last 100 years or so that we have found through biology that it takes but a single sperm to fertilize the egg. So with examples such as these, is it any wonder that we have a lot of problem with unwanted babies? And that was the prelude to my talk on Margaret Sanger, who basically started the birth control movement around the turn of the century, and you needed this to set the stage, so to speak, of the level of expertise and technology that existed in those days when she started.
That was pretty bad, but I don't think, according to what I've read, there's some pretty wild stories still going around amongst teenagers who haven't been informed. Standing up is supposed to be, that's safe. Things of that nature, just about as dumb as the hot fire. I don't understand that fire thing. That sounds like a real dangerous thing to do, but not from getting pregnant.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But there are strange, it's a rather mysterious process for most people, and I think that even today there's a good deal of blunderbussing around in the introduction to our sexual heritage, so to speak, and children need to be educated in sex. We need to be honest with them as to the entire biological facts as we know them. And we learn more about it every day. But we're embarrassed or ashamed somehow or another to talk to our children about these things?
Well, sex, I have the theory that, of course, that religion has cast sex in the bad role. That's not, instead of being a normal thing, a normal desire of a human being, it is, they talk about lust, and then the Bible is filled with things about harlots and so on, and I don't think religion has done a thing to help it. When I think what ministers could do with instructing, they're supposed to be smarter than the rest of the klutzes that whoops come in there, and you'd think that they could do so much if they would, but they won't.
Well, that's a rather involved subject, and certainly the church, all churches have contributed their part to that show. They essentially have a biased or a backward look at they cannot admit their own sexuality. That's what it boils down to.
And then it winds up with being something like the Jimmy Swaggart mess, all this sexual repression and the idea that it's so evil and sinful and terrible, they repress it to the point where then they do something perfectly ridiculous like that. But let's get on with Margaret Sanger. And when did our heroine first get the idea of, or is there something that should come before her interest in this problem?
I thought one of the most interesting facts about her life is that she was a fairly well-to-do, middle-class housewife living just north of New York City in a place called Hastings-on-Hudson, which was a upscale neighborhood. Her husband, William Sanger, was an architect and was making very good money in those days, and they had 3 children and a lovely home, custom-built home, and you wonder why someone that was fixed, or certainly well-to-do, that she didn't have any worries, would take off on an excursion in her life to work with the birth control, which, by the way, was a coined phrase of hers, and become an agitator for changing of the laws and establishing clinics and spreading information about birth control methods and the technology that existed. And so I got interested and dug into her background and read a biography and read about the birth control movement. She had a fairly traumatic experience, 2 really, when she was a young girl. One of those was the loss of her mother, who had 11 children. And she was the 6th of those 11 children, and her mother died at a relatively early age, I think 46 years old or something. And Margaret knew that the having children so close together did not help her.
And taking care of them after they get here. Good grief, what a job. That's running a hotel. Yes,
that's true. And they were spaced just average about 1.5 years apart. So that hurt her and bothered her about her mother's death. Secondly, her father was a freethinker and a Catholic apostate who happened to be in contact with the freethinkers of the day, and one of which was Robert Ingersoll, who you and I are quite familiar with in his writings and speeches. And Ingersoll was giving a speech in Corning, New York. This is where Margaret was born and raised, at a local Catholic church. And when the local priest found out that Ingersoll was going to be speaking, well, he slammed the door in their face, and they were pelted by what I would call hoodlums that were agitating
the early right to lifers.
Yes, of the day and age. That's right. And Margaret was say 13 or 14 years old at the time this happened, and she and all of her siblings were ostracized by the town and it was orchestrated by the Catholic Church. And so she had those experiences early in life, and I'm sure that they affected her thinking. And she was interested in nursing and went to a nursing school in White Plains, New York. And
Now that was before she married, right?
oh yes, this was when she was like I think 15 or 16 years old when she goes to nursing school, and it was a 4-year course, I think, at that time. She was about 19 when she graduated, and married William Sanger just about graduation time. Her nursing career took her to the, well, maybe I should back up and say that she and William built their home and raised the kids, and were living in middle-class comfort when she was about 29. But they were both unsatisfied, and he was wanting to be an artist rather than an architect, and she was interested in doing other things, and was beginning to form her opinions about distributing information about birth control, educational matters. So they sold out and moved to Greenwich Village in New York City, and it was a very exciting time, just about 2 or 3 years before World War I, and there was a lot of things happening in New York, and she was exposed to some free-thinking people that have part of the criticism of Margaret Sanger is her association with people like Eugene Debs, who was a socialist. And however, it was a time of ferment, and she was very busy down with the immigrants, and there was an enormous amount of ignorance about children, and there was the mortality rate, infant mortality rate was high, and the ignorance level was high, and here all these immigrants were packed into a small part of the city, and they were having babies just like crazy. And one of her patients, when she was nursing, died of an abortion that was performed illegally, of course, by someone that was unqualified and lacking the technical knowledge to do it without killing someone. And this lady's name was Sadie Sachs, who became a catalyst for Margaret in her effort. And she went to Europe and studied how the clinics in England and the Netherlands and other places
We're coping with this birth control with family planning or limitation, it was.
That's right. These were birth control clinics, although they were not called that at that time. It was principally a place where a woman could go to be fitted with a diaphragm.
Were they invented back then? World War I?
Well,
are we talking about prior to?
There have been things along that line from the earliest dawn of history, but sponges, all sorts of things that have been tried, and none of which work very well, mind you. And the diaphragm that was developed in Europe, I believe it's called Manzinga diaphragm by the inventor. And it required a doctor to fit this diaphragm, and so she learned about that and brought that technology back to the USA.
As usual, we were dragging behind Europe. Europe was more advanced in things of this sort than
well,
we were.
yes. You have to remember the times. Now, the turn of the century, Teddy Roosevelt was president, and Teddy thought that the duty of every family was to produce as many children as possible, because he felt it was imperative to have many young soldiers, to make sure that the country had enough youngsters to provide for an army. This was a day of union agitation and plenty of bitter fighting taking place in the mines and the textile factories. The war of the Darwin's theory of evolution was being fought in many circles. The scientific community had already acknowledged that Darwin's theory was correct, and they were going on about their business, but there was a large percentage of the population of the United States that had not come around to that.
Of course.
And still haven't.
Yes, we have them every day on the editorial page, writing letters.
Yes.
There's no such thing as evolution.
There was the industrial age was starting, and that was changing the way everybody lived. It changed the family arrangement. It changed the relationship of the person to his community and his culture and his religion, and a whole bunch of things were happening all at once. It was from 1900 to 1914 was a very forceful and bubbly period in our history.
Well, going back to that, talking about various methods of birth control being around for quite some time, I remember reading Boswell's, what was it, he was writing about Dr. Johnson, and he was referring to some of his escapades, and he said, I performed in armor last night on London Bridge. And down at the bottom it had the little asterisk which explained that that was like a condom.
Yes.
And they must have been really klutzy in those days.
Oh yes, that was only invented like about, I believe, turn of the 19th century in that, so that was
so
still relatively new.
What they did in those days, but I thought that really caught my attention. I was very surprised to hear that they had anything at all. Must not have been too effective.
The career of Margaret was hampered by a number of things. The church, not just the Catholic Church, but a lot of churches, pardon me, were against any kind of educational material. And in fact, there was the Comstock laws, which were named after Anthony Comstock, had been on the books since 1870-something. And these basically prohibited sending smut material through the mail.
That's
and birth control information was classified as smut in those days. And so Mr. Comstock, who had wangled him a place in the post office, and he became the eyes and ears, the moralizer of and the protector
of America's morals.
Of Americans' morals.
We always have one.
Yes.
Every age brings us a protector.
He charged her with a violation of one particular paragraph of the Comstock laws, but it was the wrong paragraph in Margaret's opinion, because it didn't deal with the fact that she was distributing information about birth control. It dealt with some of the other stuff, and so rather than go to jail for the wrong thing, well, she jumped bail, and that was another thing that they criticized her about. That she didn't go ahead and fight that case. Well, as it turned out, the case was thrown out of court later on because the prosecutor did not want to make a martyr out of her. That's what he said. But the truth is that more and more people were becoming aware that there was technology out there that could prevent, or you could control or space your children and have some family planning. And there were more and more people becoming interested and knowledgeable about those things. And so the prosecutor knew that he was fighting a losing battle and sort of dropped the case. Margaret wrote a number of books. I could give the titles of them. In 1917, The Case for Birth Control. And in 1920, Women and the New Race. This was back when women's rights, they were fighting the battle of obtaining the vote. And The Pivot of Civilization in 1922, Motherhood in Bondage in 1928, My Fight for Birth Control in 1931, and an autobiography in 1938. Margaret fought many battles, had turf battles. There were a number of different organizations that were in the birth control movement, or they were in and out of it at different times. She had a battle with the American Medical Association about her clinic, and she had a battle with another birth control league, and she established another one, and so there was a lot of that going on. There was some infighting.
Yes, besides just, infighting, that will really kill you. It's bad enough to have an enemy, but when your friends turn on you, that's not good.
That's right. And you mentioned earlier that she's been criticized by some people as saying that she was racist.
Oh, yes.
Yes. And there's not any evidence that I could find that would say that that could be confirmed at all. What did happen, however, is that in her quest for funds to provide the published material and to bring diaphragms in, she had to smuggle these things into the United States. Because nobody here knew how to do it, and there wasn't anything going on. And in order to do all that, it took money. And she recruited from the middle classes and the foundations and other people, all of them that she could find to get money. Well, naturally, birth control to some people meant perhaps race control, and so some of the people who gave money to her may have had an ulterior motive, but it was not tied to her directly or indirectly that I could see.
Well, of course, many of the people that she strove to help would have been the poor, and so often, unfortunately, the immigrants, some of them being of other races, I suppose they could have got upset. Maybe we're having too many Italian babies, or that sort of thing. True. They get that idea. So when she was trying to help the woman control her body and her reproductive function, then she took this flack, which persists to this day. In fact, has been revived deliberately, I'm sure, by that dreadful Randall Terry and his maniacs that run around harassing women and sitting in the doors of the clinics. So the problem still goes on today, and I think their main agenda with that also is not just to stop women from obtaining abortions, which are now legal but probably going down the drain soon, but to stop certain forms of birth control. There's RU 486, they want that in the country.
I cannot understand how any fact can change anything, or that you can change the facts. And what needs to happen is that people who are subject to having children ought to know what causes them, and what they might do to improve their own situation, and time their children in such a way that they can provide for them. Unwanted babies is a big problem today. And closing our eyes to all of this is just not getting the job done. Education is a necessity.
I know, but you're going to meet opposition at every turn. It is just incredible, the attitude in this country about sex education. Already, the far right people have said that sex education fosters sexual promiscuity, and that the rate has gone up since they started teaching about sex in school. Now, this is ridiculous. I'm sure it's ridiculous.
Well, ex post facto, everybody can blame whatever they want to on whatever it is that occurred, because you can always bend facts around to suit yourself, or that is to interpret them to suit yourself. And the only answer to those sort of things, well, what did the world do, for instance, before Darwin's theory? Who did you have to blame before then for all the mayhem?
Yeah.
Ask somebody that.
I think that that's probably the best way to approach these people, because you can't argue with them, and the only thing you can do is to try to glean what you might call information from them, or their idea of what is information on a subject, and make them look perfect fools with some of the answers they give. I've done a little bit of this with it was questions about the Bible and God and things like this. They just, they've got some fixed idea, but when it goes to explain it, they're not very good at it, and they realize that they're way off base of what they cannot answer your questions. Then they get mad. That's another retreat, is just to get
of course,
angry.
everyone is free to think the way they want to and
Fine
believe the
and
way
dandy.
they want to, and
Yeah.
I defend that right on
Yes,
on
I will
anybody.
defend it too, but not to enforce it.
But we
There.
need to educate people.
That's it.
And I do not see, I'll say it again, I don't see how a fact can hurt anybody. You need to be able to face the facts honestly as to what is actually going on, to the best of our ability and knowledge, and not mask it or syrup it over with euphemisms that they don't want to talk about it.
Well, that's true. They do tend to not want to face facts. They live in some kind of dream world where all babies are blonde and blue-eyed and precious, and everybody wants to adopt them. I can tell you that right here in San Antonio, I've seen the ads in the paper for wanted baby, and it says white baby. It doesn't say black drug-addicted baby or AIDS baby. It doesn't say that. If it doesn't come right out and say white, it does it through the back door.
Yes, and the church has been mistaken so many times in the past on all sorts of issues like slavery and racism and wars and the crusades and all that stuff, that they very well could be wrong on this birth control thing, and ask most anybody who tries it, the rhythm method doesn't really work.
Well, I'm very happy to see now we have an organization called Catholics for Choice. So they're not all going by the rules of the church. They figured it out too. This is a problem, and that's not. Well, Margaret slipped. You said she skipped bail there, or she skipped town or the country or something when she was going to be arrested, and she was arrested a number of times, though, wasn't she?
Yes, she was arrested a number of times, but was never convicted, and she won all of her cases. And won most of her battles, and by the time she ended her career, which essentially sort of took after the legislation that was passed in 1937, I believe it was, that did away with the Comstock laws and got rid of a lot of her problems. She retired and wrote her autobiography, and her husband was the president, her second husband, I should say, William Sanger, they had a divorce about 1921 or so, and she married the other man in 1923, and he was a fairly rich man, and he helped a lot.
You're not going to believe this, but the time is getting away from us. Is there any one last little crumb of information that you want to fling? Did she die respected? Was she fairly well accepted?
Yes, indeed. She died in Tucson in 1966, a very well respected woman who had accomplished her goal in life.
By intelligent people, of course.
That's right.
Well, I'm glad to know that, but now she is being maligned again on our letters pages to the editor, so that's very sad. But thank you, Stanley, for telling the people out there what Margaret Sanger was all about and what she really meant to do. And I guess that winds it up for Freethought Forum, and we'll see you again next week. Bye for now. Thanks.
I think as I please, and this gives me pleasure.
My conscience decrees, this right I must treasure.
My thoughts will not cater
To duke or dictator, no person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei.